Chapter 1. I met her, and for me, she was the most beautiful woman in the world. I hadn't expected her to be beautiful. I'd expected her to be 50 and perhaps fat. She was neither. She was, I think, only a year or two older than I, but I never knew exactly, for she never discussed her age. "You have a voice," she told me, at our first meeting. "I've heard you a dozen times in that choir where you've been singing, but you have something else which is more important. You have a way with women, old women." She smiled slightly as if daring me to agree with her, "women like me." I was too tongue-tied to say anything for a moment. I knew her reputation. She had started a dozen singers on careers. She had produced a number of radio programs herself. The stories they told about her in the Times Square district, around Radio City and in the Hollywood nightclubs were almost too fabulous to be believed. They sounded like the ravings of an overworked press agent, but I knew they were true. Linda Hale had been born in a trunk. Her family were show people, and she had had her first walk-on part at 3, coming out of the wings in a little white and pink dress. There was a picture on her dressing table of this child, and Linda always referred to her in the third person. "Poor little kid," she'd say. "Never a mud pie, never a sled and a snowy hill to slide down. You don't know how lucky you are, Gumbo." She was calling me Gumbo by then. In fact, she started calling me Gumbo that first afternoon in her office. "We'll make a star out of you, Gumbo," she'd promised. "We won't make another Crosby or another Sinatra. We'll make you Danny Gumbo. It won't be easy. You're going to work, my lad, work as you've never worked before. But, I'll personally guarantee that if you take orders, if you do everything I tell you to, you'll be making $1,000 a week, or better, within a year." I stared. I thought she was crazy. I was making $250 a week and picking up change, singing on the outside. I couldn't act. I didn't know what a mic looked like, and I'm no beauty. "Rave on," I said and stared at her. The desk was of light wood. The walls were light and a thick white rug covered the office floor. 910_. Even at the desk she wore fox furs about her throat, and I was to learn that she loved them, better even than life itself. Her hair was silver white, not platinum, and I'd have guessed that she was 27. She smiled at me and picked up the gold-plated telephone. "Tony, darling," she said. "Pick up a contract and come over here. I want you to meet my latest chump." That's how I met Linda Hale. I met Tony that afternoon also, Tony Maloney, her attorney, her partner and, as she was wont to say, her brains. He was about 40, I judged, thin and trim and well-tailored. His hair was gray at the temples and dark curly on top. His face was thin, his mouth sensitive and a little cynical. His eyes were dark and soft-looking. Somehow they did not go with the rest of his face. Maybe it was the eyelashes. They were very long and inclined to curl. He was, I thought, one of the most striking men I had ever met. He looked at Linda and I thought, "He loves her," and a pang went through me. This woman, whom I had met less than half an hour before, had captured my imagination. I'm not certain that she hadn't captured the rest of me. We were married the following July. If you own a radio, you've heard me sing. If you go to the pictures, you've seen me on the screen. I wonder just how much you know about me, how much you think of me as an individual, divorced from the characters I've played. The chances are that, if certain things had not happened, you'd have never known anything else, that I'd have remained the Danny Gumbo who played Torrid Nights, who sang in Moonstruck and who sells you light beer over the air every Tuesday night. After our marriage, Linda continued on as my agent. In fact, my main complaint was that she was more agent than wife. "You're a fool," she said. "You don't seem to realize what I'm doing for you." "I realize," I admitted. We were in our penthouse, atop one of New York's better-known hotels. Below us, coming faintly like the waves of a distant ocean, I could hear the swish of late traffic on Park Avenue. I can't help but realize. I've become a national figure, thanks to you, my darling, and I'm not. I'm just Danny Gumbo, the boy from Ohio. It was fun at first, fun having waiters recognize me, fun having people turn and stare, but now. I knew that tone. It was Linda's tone when she was aroused, when someone was crossing her. "Now," I said. "I don't like it. What's the use of working my head off, if I can't have a moment's peace to myself? I won't do it." Am I interrupting something? It was Tony Maloney, looking exactly as he had on that first afternoon in Linda's office, poised, suave, cynical. "Come in," said Linda. This fool won't listen to reason. He refuses to do what I tell him. A very bad trait in a husband. Tony came across the room to lean against the mantel. What's our little boy scout refusing to do now? He won't take Paige to dinner, Linda said, and she made it sound as if I'd failed her in the most important thing in life. I can't seem to make him understand that publicity is what he lives on, what keeps him going. I'm old-fashioned, I told Maloney. I know exactly what will happen. I'll take Paige out several times, and then my darling wife will tip off a columnist and there will be a squib. What actor is crossing what agent with what songbird, or something equally intelligent? Paige is a nice kid. She is a little green at this business, almost as bad as I was a couple of years ago. I'm not going to have her hurt, merely for some cheap publicity. He's in love with her, said Linda. I don't think she meant it. She was merely trying to get a rise out of me. I'm not, I told them, rising, but I could be. What I didn't say was that I feared that Paige Austin was attracted to me, not in any serious way. But she was just a kid, trying to break in. I was a name, and I'd been nice to her because she was Linda's newest chump. I didn't want things to go any further. I was fond of the kid, and I didn't want her hurt. Behind me I heard Maloney chuckle. Careful, Linda, my sweet, you'll give your Boy Scout ideas. She had already given me one. I wasn't going to stay there that night. I was going out, going somewhere so that I could think. Linda by her very presence always tangled me up. Everything was always out of perspective when she was around. It was at the corner of 6th and 43rd that the cop stopped me. He was a young fellow, looking bigger than he was in the bulky blue uniform. Aren't you Danny Gumbo? He said. I stopped. My mind had been 1,000 miles away and it took conscious effort to bring it back. Why, yes. I recognized you from the pictures, he said, and his voice was not unkind. You'd better come with me. Come with you? I didn't understand and said so. Haven't you seen the papers? He seemed surprised. I shook my head and he told me. Your wife, he said. She's dead. Someone killed her. I didn't get it, even then, didn't realize that almost every headline held my name, that every cop in town was looking for me. I paid for the cab to headquarters. It was better than riding in the transportation they furnish. I walked into the building like a man walking into a bad dream, and the first person I saw when I entered Captain Baldwin's office was Paige Austin. She wasn't crying, but she looked as if she were going to. She sat facing away from the door, and she didn't know I was there until the captain came to his feet. So, here you are. She turned then and said. Gumbo. It wasn't what she said, but the way she said it. I saw the glance that passed between Baldwin and the uniformed man. And then she seemed to sense her mistake and said in a more formal tone. Mr. Winston, I said, hello Paige. I tried to make my voice sound normal. I made it sound too normal. That's the trouble with acting, you overplay. I knew I was doing it and the knowledge made me angry. The cop who had picked me up hadn't told me anything. In answer to my questions he'd said. I'll let the captain tell you. But he wasn't kidding me. Linda was dead and the police had picked me up. That could mean only one thing, there had to be something suspicious about the way she had died. There was something suspicious. Someone had choked her to death, sometime between 2 and 5 in the morning. The maid, Mary, found her when she came in with the breakfast tray at 8. Captain Baldwin took me down to the morgue to see her. The place was white and clean, and smelled something like a hospital. I knew that he was watching every move I made, every expression of my face. She looked very natural in death. Her face might have been a cameo, softly carved. It gave me a shock to see her lying there. Somehow it hadn't really registered that she was dead. It was impossible that Linda was dead. I stood there, looking down at her, saying over and over to myself. This is your wife. She's dead, you should feel grief, but I felt nothing. Maybe I was numbed by the shock, felt nothing but a haunting nameless fear that rode over me. Baldwin was a tall man, thin with a lined face and tired eyes. He said, suddenly. Why'd you kill her, Winston? Was it because of Paige Austin? I turned and flared at him. I suppose Tony Maloney told you that. Baldwin's face was unreadable. He told us that you and Linda quarreled last night. That you walked out. That's right, I said. I went to a Turkish bath because I couldn't find a hotel room. I slept on one of the rubbing couches. And you could have sneaked out, gone back to the hotel, killed your wife and then gotten back to the rubbing room without anyone seeing you. That's right, I said. We had a private elevator at the hotel, automatically operated. It served the 3 penthouses. You're smart, he said. You don't deny anything we can prove. How come you didn't love your wife? Do you think a horse loves its master? I asked and saw the flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. What are you talking about? I said. Linda used me like a horse, or cow, or a slave, that belonged to her. She fed me well, saw I was decently clothed, and that was that. She didn't love you? He was not trying to conceal his surprise. I shrugged. She loved me the way a sculptor loves the statue he's created. She created me. And you hated her? I glanced again at the body, lying now under the covering sheet which Baldwin had pulled back into place. No, I said, slowly, surprised by the thought, for it had never really entered my mind before. I think I pitied her. With all that she had, all that she stood for, there was only one thing that I believed she really loved, her fox furs. He gave me a strange look. That remark may hang you, Winston, or did you read in the papers about the fox furs which were tied around her throat when she was found? I hadn't known that, and I was silent as we turned and walked back to the squad car. I'd better have a lawyer, I suggested as we got in. I don't think Tony Maloney will care to represent me. Why not? Baldwin settled back after giving the driver instructions. Because, I said. He was in love with Linda. He always has been, I think, at least for a long time before I ever met them. Chapter 2. Paige Austin said, we shouldn't be seeing each other, Gumbo. Someone, a reporter, maybe, will see us. I smiled at her. We were in a big restaurant right off Times Square, one of those affairs that's a cross between a restaurant and an old-style automat. Don't worry about it, I said. People are watching us now, they've watched every move I've made since I left police headquarters. She was a small girl, brown-haired, gray-eyed. Nothing striking about her as there had been about Linda, but a warmth and understanding, something that Linda had never had. Gumbo, I'm sorry. You didn't kill her, did you? I shook my head. No, Paige, did you? She looked at me, and there was a hurt deep in her eyes and I said, quickly. I know you didn't, but the police told me you went to see her last night. The hotel record shows that you called her from the lobby at 11:20, and they don't know when you left. She called me, said Paige. When I got there, she accused me of being in love with you. Are you? She looked at me for a long moment. I'm not quite sure. Sometimes I think I am, and I can't sleep. Other times, I think it's merely the glamour with which Rick Frost has surrounded you. Rick Frost was Linda's press agent. He'd been a sports reporter before setting up his own office. A smart man, cynical and yet with a soft streak in him. I'd liked him better than anyone else on the staff. And Tony Maloney wasn't there when you saw Linda? She shook her head. No, he'd gone, but from something Linda said I judged that he was coming back. Who killed her? Did Tony? I looked at her sharply. What makes you say that? She shrugged. He loved her. She hesitated as if hunting for words. And she used him like a dog. Sometimes I've caught him watching her when he didn't think anyone noticed. There was something in his eyes that I didn't like, I said. He's my bet, but I haven't any evidence and it's going to take evidence, Paige. Otherwise, I'll be it. I don't know why I said that. I had that haunting feeling of restlessness, a premonition. And Captain Baldwin, of course, had all but called the turn. She reached across the table, clenching her small hand over mine. Don't say that. You don't mean it. The police let you go, I laughed. The sound was bitter in my own ears. Did they? Take a look at the large gentleman at the table beside the door. He's holding that newspaper, but you can see he isn't reading it. A policeman? Dan Topper, I said. He knows this part of town like the back of his hand. The boys call him the inspector of Times Square. He's smart, honey, and he hasn't lost sight of me since I stepped out of Baldwin's office. I'm just bait. They've got me out on a string, just to see what happens. Then you shouldn't have phoned me. The worry in her voice wasn't for herself. I knew that, it was for me. I'd have been foolish if I'd done anything else, I told her. They knew we were friends. If I avoided you now, if we made a point of not seeing each other, it would make them even more suspicious. But if you want my advice, you'll go back home and stay there, she said, quickly. Would that make it easier for you? I shook my head. No, but I don't want you mixed up in this any more than need be. You weren't married to Linda. She was your agent, that's all. There's no need in dragging you into the muck. You've got your career to think of, she snapped her fingers. That for the career. I'm staying, Gumbo. I'm in this as much as you are. Whether you like it, or I like it doesn't make any difference. These things happen. You can't help yourself, but I should think the police, thinking you guilty, would be afraid you'd run away. They hope I will, I said. Running would be the worst thing I could do. They'd have me on the teletype in 15 minutes after Dan lost me. A man has no chance, running away. Trouble was, I didn't know how to fight. I let Paige leave the restaurant first and waited until she was out of sight before I stood up and moved toward the door. At Dan Topper's table I paused. I'm going over to the office, Dan. You might as well share the cab. He looked up, but didn't move. Nuts to you, killer, he said in a voice that barely reached my ears. I felt the red come up to my face. I felt my fists clench at my sides. But I knew he was purposely trying to anger me, and I didn't mean to let him. Have it your way, I said. If you'd rather stand on a cold street than sit around in a comfortable chair, that's your business. I went out, feeling that everyone in the restaurant was staring at me, caught a cab and gave the office address. It was late, almost 6, but everyone was still there. Linda had never opened the place until noon and usually closed anywhere from 7 to 8. Her clients weren't the kind of people who got up before luncheon. Katie, the blonde receptionist, let out a little squeal when she saw me. I suppose she thought death is like that 13 I'd already be decorating the end of a rope. Jensen, Linda's 50-year-old secretary, greeted me as I stepped into the inner office, but we'd never liked each other and her manner showed plainly that I was tried and convicted in her mind. I had an office of my own, a cubbyhole which I almost never used. I didn't turn towards it now, but headed straight for the big room which had been Linda's. Jensen started to rise from her own desk as if to bar my way, thought better of it and settled back. The studio called and said they were replacing you with a temporary substitute. There was malice in her tone. I nodded. I had expected that. The broadcasting company and the sponsor could hardly afford me on the air, especially until the publicity blew over, if it ever would. I went on, pushing open Linda's door, surprised that the lights were burning within the big room. Then I saw why, and a wave of sudden anger swept over me. Tony Maloney was seated in Linda's chair, calmly going through the drawers of her desk. I never realized until that moment that I had hated this man, and his quiet assumption of authority in going through Linda's desk was more than I could stand. Before he realized I was in the room, I had crossed it, reached over the desk and, grasping the lapels of his coat, jerked him to his feet. He stared at me. Get out of here before I throw you out. Why Gumber, Get out. My voice was trembling. Get out before I kill you. He means it, said a voice from the right. It was the first indication I had that we were not alone. I swung around to see Rick Frost lounging beside the window. Frost was a short man, with a thick, barrel-like body and powerful arms. His face was round, his hair and eyebrows sandy. He grinned now. Take it easy, Gumbo. Don't go haywire on us. I let go of Maloney's lapels and stepped back, finding that my hands were shaking slightly from the rage which burned through me. I was still angry, but somehow Frost's presence, his ready grin, blunted my rage. Sorry, I muttered, without meaning it. I've had a devil of a day. Maloney straightened his coat. He didn't seem to be put out by my violence, and nothing ever seemed to crack his cynical calm. That's okay. I imagine it was something of a shock to walk in here and find me calmly going through Linda's things. But we thought you were still in the hands of the police, and someone had to do it. Do what? The anger had all drained out of me now, leaving me empty and ill at ease. Search her desk, said Maloney. The cops have already been through it, but since they might not have known what they were looking for, they might not find it. I borrowed a cigarette from Rick Frost and used the pause it took to light it to pull myself together. And what were they looking for? I asked. I saw Maloney throw a quick glance toward Frost. Then he said to me, I guess you were about the only one in the world who didn't know it, but our friend Linda was one of the most accomplished little blackmailers who ever lived. He held up his hand as I tried to speak. Wait a minute, Winston. You don't like me, and I can't say that I've ever been really fond of you, but we're in this thing together whether we like it or not. But She wasn't a blackmailer in the ordinary sense, he went on. She knew a lot of things about a lot of people, things that they wouldn't want told. Remember, she grew up in show business, and she was smart. The boys around the Rialto knew that if they had the dirt on someone, Linda would pay money for it, good money. Didn't it ever occur to you to wonder how she managed some of the deals she put over, that she had to know where the bodies were buried, or she wouldn't have gotten away with the things she did? His words made sense. I was seeing things that I had never really understood before, seeing a new Linda. I'd known she was hard, ruthless, but I'd thought she pushed through on her glitter, on her personal charm. His put an altogether new slant on many things. I guess I'm just dumb, I said. That's right, Rick Frost told me, one of the dumbest bums that ever hit the stem. Surprisingly, Tony Maloney shook his head. No, you aren't, he said. You were just so busy being a success, thinking about yourself, that you never bothered to think about much of anything else. And Linda made darn certain that you didn't find out. I don't blame you if you did kill her. I looked at him, startled. I thought you loved her? For 10 years, he said, his mouth twisting. I loved her, and I think at times I hated her. One thing about Linda, she inspired emotion of some kind. You couldn't ignore her. I asked something that had bothered me for a long time. Why didn't you marry her? I was too smart, he said. Linda was possessive. She had to control people, body and soul. I couldn't play the game that way, and yet, I couldn't stay entirely away from her. I compromised by being her attorney. I saw more of her than almost anyone else, and I think I'm the one person whose opinion she respected. If we'd been married, that wouldn't have been true. I knew he was telling the truth. Strange, I was seeing things in their proper perspective for the first time since I'd walked into her office. I went over and sank onto a window seat. All right, I'll assume for the moment you didn't kill her. Paige says that something Linda dropped led her to believe that you were going back to the penthouse late last night. Did you go? For the barest fraction of an instant he hesitated. The hesitation wouldn't have been noticeable if I hadn't been watching him closely. Then he nodded. I went back, he said. Linda sent me out to look for you. She was really burned when you walked out. I think it was the first time you'd ever crossed her. I nodded. She called Paige, he went on. And told her to come over. She didn't really want to see Paige. All she wanted was to make certain that you hadn't gone over there. Then she sent me out. I tried every place I could think of. Several hotel clerks said you'd been there, trying to get a room, but I couldn't locate you. I was at a Turkish bath. He snapped his fingers and I got the impression that he was angry at himself. I should have thought of that. But I didn't. I finally went back to the penthouse to report. I didn't like the idea of going. I knew Linda would be furious, and unpleasant. I meant to tell her off. I'd had about enough. Did you? He shook his head. I didn't. She was already dead. I don't know why I tell you this. I didn't tell the police, and if you give them the story, it's not going to put me in a good light, but, well, I guess you have a right to know. That's one for the book, Rick Frost said. Tony Maloney goes soft. Color darkened Maloney's face. He swung to say something to the press agent, then checked himself and added to me. You and Paige are in a tough spot. Anything that will help. Let's keep her out of this. Rick Frost laughed. You've got a fat chance of doing that. Dan Topper and Baldwin already have her slated for the big act. It makes better copy that way. I turned on him angrily. Don't you ever think of anything but headlines? What else is there? He drew a pipe from his pocket and began to fill it. I looked at him for a long moment, thinking that the only man in town that I really trusted was deserting me, then I turned back to Maloney. Tony, I said. You knew Linda a lot longer than I did. Tell me something. What made her love Silver Fox fur so much? Maybe if we knew that, and knew who knew it, it might be a clue. The murderer wrapped her furs about her throat after he finished choking her. Maloney's face got a strained look. I'm afraid that won't help you, he said, the words coming out in a kind of rush. You see, Gumbo, I put those furs around her throat. She was lying there, dead. His voice broke a little at the word and I saw him shiver, then recover himself. She looked so alone, so cold, and the furs were on the couch. I took them and put them around her. The silence in the office was a heavy, solid thing. None of us felt like speaking. Rick Frost was the first to recover and he spoke in a different tone than I'd ever heard him use. Well, chumps. Where do we go from here? We were Linda's boys. Going to try and carry on the office, Gumbo? I suppose it belongs to you. I hadn't thought about that angle. The office and all it represented was mine, but I didn't want it. I said. I couldn't carry on if I wanted to. I don't know the angles. I'm no salesman, and most of the clients didn't like me, they resented me, Rick said. You're smarter than I thought. Maloney can carry on if he wants to. I glanced toward the lawyer. He's been running the business end for years, anyway. Why don't you two combine? I'll turn the works over to you. They looked at each other. Maloney cleared his throat. There's an angle you haven't thought of, maybe. I said Linda was a blackmailer. She had her secret file, and maybe some of the boys who are on it are going to want to make certain that the information she had doesn't pass into the wrong hands. But this file, where is it? He hesitated for an instant. In my office. I shouldn't tell you this, I suppose. It would be better if I burned the cards and let it go at that. I'm telling you for a reason. You're going to be approached in the next 24 hours by a number of characters. They'll all conclude that you inherited the file. It wasn't fair for you not to know what they are talking about. He broke off, again hesitating, then he drew an automatic from his coat pocket. Ever use one of these? I was surprised. Why yes, but, he said. Take it. Some of the boys Linda dealt with were rough characters. They might try and get rough with you. I took the gun and said. Maybe one of them killed her. Maybe if we went through the list it would give us a lead. Maloney shrugged. There are over 1,000 cards in that file, a lot of suspects, if you ask me. Even Dan Topper couldn't sort them out. However, the file is yours if you want it. Why yes, I said. I want it. A lot of the names can come off. We can check. They wouldn't be in town and they could hire it done, Maloney told me. However, come on, we'll take a look, anyhow. Chapter 3. 1,000 file cards aren't so many. Linda had arranged them carefully and the notations were in her slanting script. Evidently she hadn't wanted them seen even by a typist. I borrowed a briefcase from Maloney and carted them back to the penthouse, conscious that Dan Topper was staying with. I thought that, although they did not know it, the police were furnishing me with a bodyguard. I might need one before the night was over. I wanted Maloney to come, but he shook his head. I wouldn't do you any good, and I don't want any part of it. I only stood for the fib because of Linda. Scared? I said, without meaning what he read into it. His eyes grew smoky. Then he nodded. Frankly, yes. Men are on that list who have killed before and might well kill again. Linda overlooked few bets. The best thing is to burn it. But you've been over it, I said. You know what is on some of the cards? His tone had an unwilling note. Yes, I've been over it. I know what is on some cards. Would some be missing? He looked at me sharply. What do you mean by that? The murderer might have stolen his own card. I pointed out. Who besides Linda knew that these things were kept in your office, not hers? No one. Then the murderer's card is still in this bunch, I told him. By the way, is your name on this list? I thought for an instant that he would hit me. He controlled himself with a visible effort and said tensely. What do you mean by that, Gumbo? I shrugged. Only that I'm learning fast. From what I've learned and from knowing her, I can't think that my darling wife would trust anyone unless she had the dead wood on them. He laughed. It was a short, sharp, bitter sound. You're right, he said. But Linda would not keep the card referring to me where I could lay my hands on it. You won't find it there. I don't know where she kept it. You might have killed her for it. He nodded. I might have, any time during the last 10 years. I picked up the briefcase and turned to where Rick Frost stood, watching us. I think you're a friend of mine. Do you want to help? He grinned. I might help at that, if the job wasn't too tough a one, I said. All I want you to do is to circulate around the district, the drugstore where all the boys hang out, the night spots, drop a word here and there. Just say that I have Linda's list. It won't mean a thing to the ones who aren't on it. The ones who are will know what you're talking about. Can do, Maloney said. You are a fool, Winston. You're making a clay pigeon of yourself. You're making a bid for someone to kill you. I shrugged. I might as well be murdered as have the state kill me for a murderer. Death is the same no matter how it comes. I picked up the briefcase and moved toward the door. Coming, Rick? He grinned at me. Righto. I've published a lot of things, but this is the first blackmail list I ever press agented. I hope it does you some good, although I doubt it. There was no cab in sight and the night was clear. Think I'll walk? He raised a hand. Be seeing you. I go the other way. I watched him swing off down the street, whistling softly to himself. If Linda's death affected him, he gave no sign. I walked along, trying to think. After a block I opened the case and started to glance through the cards. Some of the names listed and the information contained made me catch my breath. If that list were published, it certainly would make juicy reading. I was surprised to find Paige listed. There wasn't anything startling about her date of birth, parents' names, schools, jobs. Linda had certainly been thorough. A curious, dispassionate anger flowed through me as I found a card with my name on it. Linda must have hired detectives to get the information. Even the 3 nights I'd spent in jail during my senior year at college were listed. I passed a hotel, retraced my steps and went into the writing room. Seated at the little desk, I saw Dan Topper pass the door twice and grinned sourly to myself. My actions must have been confusing to anyone trailing me. Then the grin died as the nameless fear took hold of me again. Topper was the law that should have been my protection and was, instead, my antagonist. I left the hotel and saw that Topper followed me. He made no effort at concealment, yet he stayed almost half a block behind. He followed grimly and it might have been humorous, this dogged pursuit, had it not been that my nerves were jumpy, on edge, so that I was almost doubting my own innocence. The automatic elevator which led to the penthouses was reached by a small side corridor from the main lobby. It could also be reached from the street, if you knew the way, and I came in through this side entrance, not feeling like facing the crowded lobby. There was no attendant in the small corridor and I pushed the button and waited impatiently until the car came down. I got in hurriedly and pushed the button marked roof. The door closed itself and the car started upward. Even in the small elevator I had the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting behind some hidden corner to spring out at me. I didn't know what I would find upstairs. The police might have left a guard in the apartment, or the hotel management might have stationed a bellboy there to prevent curiosity seekers. The car came to a halt with a slight jar, the door slid open. I stepped out into the small hall which served the 3 penthouses. On the other side of this hall was the public elevator, one shaft of which rose from the lobby and which most guests used. Beyond it was a stairway with a steel fire door. I stared at this stairway. I'd forgotten its existence since we had never used it, but the murderer could have come that way. I crossed the hall, fitted my key into the lock, opened the door and stepped into the penthouse. It was quiet inside. I hadn't expected it to be anything else. The maid came in by the day and left at 6. If we wanted anything after that we called room service. I turned on the foyer lights, looking around the small hall. Then I flipped my hat onto the small hall table, recalling as I did so that Linda had never allowed me to leave it there. It was curious, but the only things I remembered about Linda were the prohibitions she had set up. I never remembered her complimenting me for anything, and I thought bitterly, I'm glad she's dead. I should feel sorry about it, but I'm no hypocrite, I don't feel sorry. I shook myself, as a dog might, trying to rid my mind of Linda. It seemed that she haunted me worse now than she ever had alive. Everything I saw reminded me of her, everything I touched. I walked into the long living room, still carrying the briefcase, but I didn't turn on the lights. I went over to the window and stood looking down at the street, far below. I heard nothing behind me. I did not know there was anyone else within the room until the blow fell. It came against the back of my head with sickening force. I thought, even as I fell, that it was a sap, a sandbag, something soft and giving and yet deadly. I wasn't out. Why I wasn't I don't know, for the force of the blow had stunned my nerve centers and made it impossible for me to move. Nor was I fully conscious, for I knew only vaguely that someone had stooped, caught up the briefcase and was carrying it into the foyer. How long I lay there, I'll never know. Probably it was for seconds only, maybe for minutes. I came to my full senses to find that I was on my hands and knees, trying to get up. The noise in the foyer seemed to be continuing. I was certain I heard the door close. I struggled to my feet, grasping the heavy window drape for momentary support. Then I felt in my coat pocket for the gun Maloney had given me. It was still there, and I took it out. I just had sense enough to slip the safety before I started across the room. Then I heard a movement in the foyer. Whoever it was had not gone. I hurried, although my legs seemed to be made out of a curious rubbery substance which was not quite firm. I reached the connecting door, stepped through it, my gun raised. Hands up. I poked the gun almost directly into Paige Austin's face. She gasped, and I almost dropped the gun. Paige, where did you come from? What are you doing here? She was staring at me, at the gun which I held, clenched in my hand. Beyond her I saw Maloney's briefcase, a little to the right, leaning against the hall wall, its straps fastened. Gumbo, what's the matter? What's happened? What are you doing with that gun? I looked at the automatic stupidly for a moment, as if I'd never seen it before, then I slid the safety into place and put the gun in my pocket. How long have you been here?
Why, I just came in.
I knocked and no one answered. I thought that strange since I could see the light from the crack under the door. So, I tried the knob. The door was unlocked and I came in. I stood there, watching her, trying to decide whether or not she was telling the truth. I saw the worry in her eyes, heard her say. But you, something's happened. You're acting strangely. I've been hit on the head. I told her. Someone was waiting for me in the darkened living room when I came in. But, what did they, who was it? I don't know yet, I said, picking up the briefcase. I carried it back into the living room and turned up the lights. You shouldn't have come here. I know it, she said, watching me as I ran through the cards. But I couldn't help it, Gumbo.
I had to see you, to talk to you, to know you were all right.
I wanted to believe her, and yet. Did you see anyone as you came up, anyone who might have been leaving here? She shook her head. Why should anyone want to break in here to knock you out? For these cards, I said. She stared at them, her eyes wide. What are they? I hadn't intended to tell her, but I did. You see, I finished. Linda used the knowledge she had accumulated about people to force them to do what she wished. I remember last winter when she put on that play by those Hollywood writers, I thought it funny that two of the town's biggest gamblers would put up the money. Let's see, I ran through the cards and I could feel my face burn. They're here all right. One of them is an escaped convict, the other. I broke off for I'd heard sound from the room behind me and I was pretty certain that Paige hadn't made any noise. He was standing in the doorway, watching me, a man about 40, black-haired, with a dark, oval face and two full lips. I felt my face muscles go stiff, for I knew him. Most people who make the nightclubs their habit knew Connie Snyder, and no one seemed to know exactly what he did, but he could be here for one reason and one only, his name must be on one of Linda's cards. I managed to twist my lips into a smile. Hello, there. Nice of you to knock. He didn't answer. He stepped into the room and another man came in after him. This man was tall and thin. He was so thin that the bony framework of his face stood out against the skin, making him look like a living skeleton. This the guy, Connie? Snyder nodded. He'd thrown one look at Paige, then turned his full attention on me. Evening, Gumbo. Something very cold seemed to be clawing its way slowly up my back. I didn't like Snyder. I'd never liked him, but up until this moment he'd been of no importance to me. He was now. He was here for something, and how he'd act in getting it was of the utmost importance to me and Paige. For an instant I'd forgotten her presence. I wished fervently that she were somewhere else. Sorry to hear about Linda. Snyder was lipping his words. There was no meaning in them. He might have remarked about the weather. Understand you have a list she was keeping? I nodded, dumbly, and his eyes fell on the cards. I could see his face tighten. At least, he said. Linda didn't talk in the wrong places, not when she was taken care of. I wanted to tell him that I wouldn't talk either, that I had no interest in what he had done or what he meant to do in the future. All I wanted was to have him leave Paige and me alone. And then I thought of the purpose of bringing the file here. It was to be used for bait, to draw the murderer to me. I looked at Connie Snyder, at his slender hands, trying to picture him as the man who had killed Linda. I didn't doubt that he would kill if it served his purpose, that he had killed in the past, but had he killed Linda? For some reason I couldn't picture him choking her. The gun would be more his style, and if he could hire it done, I doubted that he would use the gun himself. For all his arrogance there was a careful streak in the man. He was a sure-thing player, not a real gambler. For this reason I said, quickly. I've got the list here. I was just going to look it over. He gave me a stare. Meaning you've never seen it? My mouth felt a little dry as if it were filled with cotton. That's right. There's a card with my name on it in that list, the same as yours. I thought you said you hadn't looked. How do you know my name is on Linda's list if you haven't looked? Would you be here if it wasn't? I might, he said, and grinned at me thinly. Didn't it ever occur to you, Junior, that list might be valuable to a guy who knew how to use it right? That was an angle I hadn't thought of, an angle I didn't like. I wasn't going to use Linda's list myself, and I certainly didn't mean to turn it over to a sharper like Connie Snyder to blackmail Broadway with. I said. Now, look. I don't want any trouble with you, Connie, and I don't want any trouble with anyone else. I was going to use this list to try and find Linda's murderer. After that, I'm going to burn it. You kill me, he said, and he wasn't smiling. You bumped your wife yourself. Everyone in town knows it. Quit stalling and hand over those cards. I shrugged. Help yourself. There isn't much I can do to stop you. He moved forward and gathered up the cards, turning to look at me speculatively. If I thought you'd look them over. Sure he has, said the skeleton man. Don't trust him, boss. Both him and the dame know too much, Connie said. We gotta be careful. Dan Topper is downstairs, and there may be other flat feet hanging around. His gunman sneered. So what? Look, we can bump him and the dame. Topper will figure that he got scared of the police, knocked over the broad and then gunned himself, a cinch. He watched me with glittering, deep-set eyes. I wondered if I could get the automatic from my pocket. I was pretty certain I couldn't before he shot me. His hand was on his gun, although it wasn't in sight. It was Paige who surprised them, and me. She'd been standing perfectly quiet, without a word, her hands at her sides, one clutching her purse. Suddenly I noticed the purse was open. She raised her other hand now and there was a gun in it. It was the smallest gun I've ever seen, but still a gun. Put your hands up, she told the skeleton man. You too, she swung the gun a little, so that it covered Connie Snyder. He swung away from me to face her. Drop that pop gun, sister, or I'll feed it to you. He took a step toward her. But not this one, I said, and brought Maloney's automatic into sight. Hold it, Connie, I'd love to put a bullet into your back. He stopped, turned and slowly raised his hands, his thin lips curving a little. Well, look who comes to life. My voice sounded harsh, even in my own ears. I said I didn't want any trouble with you. I don't, but you butted into this. You're in and you're going to stay here. Turn around. He turned and I got the gun from under his arm. Then I did the same for the skeleton man and, after that, told the girl. There's tape in the bathroom. Get it, will you? She got it, helped me fasten their wrists and ankles. When that was done I said. I didn't know you were a gun girl? I'm not, her voice was shaking a little. My father gave me that when I came to New York. He had the idea that there was danger in a big city. I've always carried it, but, it wasn't even loaded. Connie Snyder, bound securely in a chair, swore harshly. The skeleton man said nothing, but his deep-set eyes burned with an all-consuming hate. What are you going to do? Paige was still trembling a little as she looked at the prisoners. I shook my head. I don't know, I told her. First I want to see if Snyder is on that list. I turned and picked up the cards. He was there all right, so much there that Linda had utilized 2 cards to record his exploits. Room runner, bootlegger, numbers operator, and cigarette black marketeer. The card gave further information, source of his supply, warehouse location. I began to think that the police had overlooked a bet in not hiring my wife. She seemed to have been able to secure information that apparently was beyond their grasp. Is he there? The girl had walked over to my side. I nodded and showed her the cards. A fine, upstanding citizen. Now look, Paige, I'm going to leave you here with our friends. Frankly, I don't know what to do. I want to talk to Tony Maloney for one thing. She stared at me, wide-eyed. Gumbo, is he tied up in this? I don't know, I said. That's what I want to find out. He was the only one who had a key to this apartment, besides Linda and myself. Whoever was waiting to knock me out as I came in had a key. I want to ask Maloney about it. Chapter 4. Dan Topper's cab trailed mine to Maloney's apartment. I watched it, wondering what would happen if I were to stop Topper and tell him what I suspected. It seemed the sensible thing to do, but I knew, deep down, that I'd get the same answer I'd gotten in the restaurant earlier. Nuts to you, killer. In Dan Topper's eyes I was a murderer, squirming, trying to get out of the consequences of my crime, trying to throw the blame onto someone else. The apartment was an old building in the 30s, between Lexington and 3rd. I'd been there a couple of times and the old elevator man nodded. "Mr. Maloney went up an hour and a half ago." I nodded, stepped off at the 4th floor and knocked. Nothing happened and I knocked again, louder this time, my hand shaking a little, for I'd just thought of something. Still no response and I turned back toward the elevator, intending to get the old operator. Then I stopped. Dan Topper was lurking somewhere out front. If what I feared was true, I'd be held, delayed. And Paige was alone in my apartment with Connie and his goonsel. Instead, I turned toward the end of the hall. There was a big window at the side of Maloney's apartment, a window of which he was justly proud, which opened into a little, narrow balcony. I'd been out on this balcony. It was hardly bigger than a dining room table, but it was possible to reach it from the fire escape. I slid up the window at the end of the hall and stepped out onto the iron grating. From the fire escape, I could see that the lights were on inside the apartment. I stepped across to the little balcony and tried the window. It wasn't locked and I raised the wide sash. The window seat inside was covered with potted plants. I got past them and stepped in. The room was empty. I stood for a moment looking uncertainly at the well-filled bookcases, then crossed to the hall which led back to the bedroom. Maloney lay in the hall. He apparently had been trying to get away, realizing his danger, and hadn't made it. The bullet had caught him directly in the back, under the left shoulder blade. It had probably reached the heart. I wondered why the sound of the shot had attracted no one, and then I heard the rattle of the L, only a few lots distant. If the shot had come while a train were passing, certainly no one would have had to have noticed. Much as I hated to, I stooped down and went through the lawyer's pockets, looking for his keys. They were there in a little leather folder, which I drew out and examined. The key to the penthouse was missing. I stood for a long minute staring down at him. Certainly he had not survived Linda long. Their lives had been curiously linked and they were united now. Death was like that. I turned away and moved to the outer door. It fastened on a night latch and I let myself out, the door locking automatically behind me. When the elevator came up, the old man said, "You didn't stay long." "Guess he's not home," I said and stepped into the car. "But he must be. I haven't taken him down." "Maybe he walked down," I said. "Or maybe he was in bed and didn't want to be disturbed. I'll see him later." I left the building as hurriedly as I could and walked to 3rd Avenue. I own that I was relieved when a cab came sliding between the L posts and drew to a stop at my signal. I'd been afraid that the old man might investigate, might raise a cry before I got out of the neighborhood. I settled back and gave the address of my hotel in a voice loud enough to reach Dan Topper on the curb where he was looking up and down the street vainly for a cab. Then I settled back and tried to think. At the hotel, the first person I saw was Rick Frost. He came forward to greet me in the little hall that led to the private elevator, his round face wearing a worried frown. "Gumbo. Am I glad to see you? I couldn't figure what was going on." I stared at him. "Going on? What are you talking about?" he said. "I called the apartment and Paige answered. She wouldn't tell me why she was there or where you were, or anything. All she said was that I couldn't come up." I stepped to the house phone at the side of the elevator and called the penthouse. "Paige, it's me, Gumbo. I'm coming up, everything okay?" Her voice had a little tremor of relief. "Yes, everything's okay. Our guests are getting restless, come on." I hung up and, motioning to Frost to follow, stepped into the little car. "I'm glad to see you," I told him. "Something's happened and I need advice. I went over to get it from Maloney." "I didn't." "Wasn't he there?" "He was dead," I said. "Someone shot him in the back." Rick swore under his breath. "Probably after Linda's list." I hadn't thought of that and said so as the car stopped and I opened the door for him. Paige met us at the penthouse entrance, her surprise showing at sight of Frost. "I thought you went for Maloney." "He couldn't come," I told her. "In here, Rick. I want you to see our visitors. I want you to tell me what to do with them." He followed me to the living room door and stopped, again swearing under his breath. "Connie." Snyder looked at us from his place in the chair. "Tell the fool to turn us loose, Frost. I'll see that he burns for this, plenty." "The cops are trying to make me burn," I told him. "I'm afraid your efforts wouldn't get far compared with theirs." "But what?" Frost was staring at me. "He's on Linda's list," I said. "He came up here to do something about it. The question is, what am I going to do with him?" Frost said, slowly. That will take some thinking. Wait, I said. You think about it. I want to see Paige for a minute. I pulled her after me into the foyer, lowering my voice. When I stepped back into the living room door a couple of minutes later, Connie Snyder was stretching his arms and Frost was just releasing the skeleton man. Then Snyder had a gun in his hand and raised it so that it covered me. Come in, my friend. What was that you were saying about me not burning you? I stared at Frost, who had straightened and was grinning at me crookedly. The easiest way is to turn them loose, Gumbo. So I see, I told him. The skeleton man said, suddenly. Hey, where's the dame? I looked at him. I sent her home. Snyder swore and took a quick step toward the door, then stopped as if he realized that it was impossible to head Paige off. I said to Frost. So, you couldn't bear to see your pals tied up? He fumbled. Or maybe, I said. You mean to kill me, as you killed Maloney and Linda? Hey, wait, it was Connie Snyder who spoke. We didn't kill your wife. I didn't say that you did, I told him. I was talking to Frost. He choked Linda to death and he killed Maloney this evening. Snyder turned to look at the press agent. Frost said. He's crazy. Why would I want to kill Linda? Why should I bump off Tony? Both for the same reason, I said. Linda had your name on the list. You are crazy. It isn't there now, I told him, because you stole it, after you'd knocked me on the head. Let me guess at what you did tonight. You and I left Maloney's office together. I walked over here. You started out to spread the news that I had the list, only, you didn't. You went directly to Maloney's apartment, climbed the stairs and went in through the big window, the same way I did. You waited until he got home, which was almost at once, according to the time the elevator man said he arrived. He came in, saw you and guessed what you were doing there and started to run down the hall towards the bedroom. Maybe he had a second gun there, he'd given me the other. Anyhow, you shot him, because you knew he'd looked at the list and seen your name on the card. You searched him and got the key to this penthouse from his ring. You then came over here, intending, I think, to kill me and try and make it look like suicide. I hadn't gotten here yet, so, you hid, knocked me out and stole your file card. Why you didn't take the whole file, I'll never know. Probably afraid that Topper or some other cop might spot you in the hotel and pick you up for questioning. But you wanted the file, for you'd concluded that in the right hands, that list could be very valuable, so, you sent Snyder and his gunman after it. Frost said, not speaking to me. He's crazy, Connie. Even if there had been a card, why should I have chosen last night to kill Linda? I said. I'll tell you why, and I can prove there was a card. You see, Rick, I figured that anyone who Linda worked with would be on that list. I was curious about you, since I thought you were the one man I could trust. I stopped in a hotel on the way over here and looked at your card. You knifed a man in a newspaper brawl in Fort Worth in 1924, but that wasn't the important thing. The card said that you've been peddling black market cigarettes for our friend here. It worked in well with your publicity contacts. And I know Linda. She wouldn't have stood for it, not because of patriotic reasons alone, but from her angle you were jeopardizing her business. So, she called up and told you to come over last night. You argued, you lost your head, and you killed her. Snyder swore. Frost said stubbornly. You still can't prove any of this. I nodded. Yes, I can. You see, Rick, when I read what was on your card, I had a hunch. There in the hotel writing room, I copied the card, faking Linda's writing. The copy I put back in the file, and it was that you lifted, the other is hidden in the desk of that writing room. What hotel? The words came out before he thought and Snyder laughed. So, you're a killer. From the foyer Dan Topper stepped into the room, reinforced by two of the hotel's staff. Watch it, Frost. Rick Frost ignored the warning. He must have known what was coming, but he tried to raise his gun. Topper shot him twice, then swung to cover Connie Snyder and the skeleton man. Want any? Connie Snyder spread his hand. You've got nothing on us, Copper, we didn't help that rat strangle Linda. Her husband will tell you, I said. Yeah, but we'll send you away for this cigarette thing, and you were fixing to kill both me and Paige. You can't shoot a guy for trying, Connie Snyder said. Topper growled and I could tell he'd have loved to squeeze the trigger. He didn't. The police are well disciplined. Later Paige said. But when you brought him up in the elevator, you knew he was guilty. Otherwise you wouldn't have sent me back downstairs to get Topper. I nodded. That's right, but I had no real proof that he'd killed Linda. I had the card from her file, and I was morally certain he'd killed Maloney and stolen the penthouse key, but that still didn't prove the murder. I had to get him to give himself away. I didn't want you there when it happened, and I did want Topper to walk in, so I sent you after him. She nodded. I'm glad it's over. Poor Linda, she didn't need that list. She had a lot of ability, a lot. A lot, I said. Too much for me, I guess, Paige said. I'm going home tomorrow. I don't think I like New York. It isn't New York, I told her. It's just that we got tied up in something. Don't forget to let me have the address before you go. I might write you a letter sometime. She didn't forget.